Once upon a time, there was an ambitious young writer. Let's call him George. George's favourite book was The Lord of the Rings. He loved it so much, he even borrowed an R from its author's name. He also borrowed the idea of a fancy world filled with dragons, kings, and terrifying monsters. But he wanted his to feel unique. He wanted mysteries and conspiracies. He wanted grey morals and disillusioned heroes. In 1996, he released A Game of Thrones, and pretty much everyone loved this new, darker kind of fantasy. It managed to feel both familiar and fresh, epic and accessible. No one could work out quite how George had made it so good. They wondered if he had used some kind of dark magic or a simple mummer's trick. Well, I think I've cracked the case. What I believe George really did was what he does best: borrow. This time he borrowed the protagonist and the key story beats from a hard-boiled crime story and transplanted them into his fantasy world. Hard-boiled fiction is usually set in America between the two world wars, the 1920s and 30s. It's a version of America riddled with corrupt officials and organized crime. The protagonist is usually a detective, investigating a crime only to stumble upon a larger conspiracy. One of the best examples, and certainly my favourite, is The Big Sleep by Ramin. It was adapted into a movie starring Humphrey Bogart. In a recent video, I said that A Game of Thrones is structured around Ned Stark's storyline, with every other plot thread branching off of it. In this video, I'm going to prove that Ned's story, the trunk holding the whole Game of Thrones tree together, is really, beat for beat, a hard-boiled crime story, which just happens to take place in a fantasy setting. But more importantly, I'm going to explain why this genre-bending works so well in A Game of Thrones, and how you can use it to supercharge your own stories. Let's start off by taking a look at the main story beats from The Big Sleep, and compare them to the corresponding beats from Ned's story. Spoilers for both books and their respective adaptations ahead. The Big Sleep opens on private detective Philip Marlowe arriving in the main hallway of a grand mansion. He notices a broad stained glass panel showing a knight in dark armor rescuing a lady. She's tied to a tree and doesn't have any clothes on. He doesn't seem to be trying very hard. This first glance at Marlowe tells us a lot about him. The symbolism of the knight immediately tells us that Marlowe is the 1930s equivalent, but Marlowe's interpretation of the scene is maybe even more telling. He's cynical, immediately questioning the motives of the knight. This isn't a starry-eyed hero. This is a world-weary veteran. Next, Marlowe meets Carmen Sternwood, the youngest daughter of his prospective client. She immediately tries to seduce him, but Marlowe shows no hint of being tempted. Once more, this is the symbolism of the virtuous knight, demonstrating his honour despite a corrupt world. When he at last meets General Sternwood himself, the old man is described as more dead than alive. There are orchids in the room, and Sternwood asks if Marlowe likes them. Not particularly, says Marlowe. Rather than being offended, Sternwood agrees. They are nasty things. Their flesh is too much like the flesh of men. Their perfume has the rotten sweetness of a prostitute. This is more imagery of a world consumed by violence and vice. The conversation turns to Rusty Regan, the third husband of Sternwood's older daughter, Vivian, who we haven't met yet. He was a bootlegger, but one who Sternwood had affection for before he recently disappeared. He was the breath of life to me, says the old man. But this isn't why Sternwood has brought Marlowe here. Sternwood is being blackmailed. A bookseller named Geiger has compromising photos of Carmen and is threatening to make them public. Sternwood asks Marlowe his advice, and at first Marlowe suggests he pays Geiger off, basically turning down the case. After some back and forth though, the old man says, "I have pride, sir." At this, Marlowe agrees to take the case, to investigate Geiger and work out the best way to neutralize him. The first act ends with Sternwood's other daughter, Vivian, also trying to seduce Marlowe. She's hoping to find out if her father has commissioned him to investigate Rusty's disappearance, but he turns her down too and says nothing, demonstrating his relative virtue once more. While Westeros, at face value, feels like a very different setting to 1930s America, the way Ned's story opens is surprisingly similar to Marlowe's. The first time we see Ned, he's executing a man, but rather than an act of cruelty, he views it as his solemn duty to do the deed himself. He tells his sons that while other lords have headsmen, if you would take a man's life, you owe it to him to look into his eyes and hear his final words. If you cannot bear to do that, then perhaps the man does not deserve to die. This has very obvious parallels to the way Marlowe reacts to the stained glass knight. Ned feels his fellow lords and knights lack honour, exemplified by Theon using the dead man's head as a football. In the next chapter, we see Ned from Catelyn's point of view. He's sitting beside a dark pool beneath a weirwood tree, washing the blood off his blade. The weirwood's bark was white as bone, its leaves dark red, like 1,000 blood-stained hands. A face has been carved into the trunk of the great tree, its features long and melancholy, the deep-cut eyes red with dried sap and strangely watchful. Once more, this symbolism is incredibly similar to Chandler's. Just like the orchids, described as having flesh too much like a man's, the weirwood is also used to evoke human anatomy. Bone and blood-stained hands with a literal face carved into it. Over the next few chapters, the Lannisters arrive in Winterfell. We see Jaime and Cersei's incestuous affair and their attempt to murder Bran when he discovers it. We also meet King Robert, who Ned feels is hardly recognisable from the clean-shaven, clear-eyed man he had once known. This also has parallels to the Big Sleep, as both the King and General Sternwood represent decline, a more heroic age which is now past. And if you really think about it, the way Robert's rebellion is thought of in Westeros bears a striking similarity to how the First World War was thought of in our world. The soldiers of World War I were often called the Greatest Generation, but by the 1930s, America was blighted by the Great Depression and the unprecedented rise of organised crime. In the world of Ice and Fire, its fictional in-world author writes of the peaceful years at the height of good King Robert's reign, but that the death of the noble hand John Arryn has unleashed a madness on the land. What George R.R. Martin is telling us is that A Game of Thrones is indeed set in the Westeros equivalent of 1930s America, a period between two continental wars. Towards the end of the first act of A Game of Thrones, Catelyn and Ned discuss whether Ned should accept Robert's offer to become his hand. As they do so, they receive a secret message from Catelyn's sister, telling them that Jon Arryn was murdered by Queen Cersei. Catelyn feels this is even more reason for him to accept, but Ned replies, "The South is a nest of adders I would do better to avoid. My father went south once, at the summons of a king. He never came home again." Maester Luwin retorts, "The hand of the king has great power, my lord. Power to find the truth of Lord Arryn's death. Power to bring his killers to the king's justice. Power to protect Lady Arryn and her son if the worst be true." With this, Ned feels compelled to accept. Just as in The Big Sleep, our hero at first refuses to take on the investigation, but in both stories they feel they have to accept once it's made a matter of duty. In the second act of The Big Sleep, Marlowe visits Geiger's bookshop and quickly works out they're actually peddling pornography. He stakes out the place, waiting for a glimpse of Geiger, then follows him to a house. Suddenly, there's a flashlight lightning and a scream. Marlowe bursts into the house. He finds Geiger dead and Cameron Sternwood sat naked and drugged in a chair. From here on in, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, so I'm going to keep the rest as brief as possible. Even though Geiger is dead, Marlowe still needs to understand what happened so he can ensure Carmen and Sternwood are safe. As he continues his investigation, he keeps having run-ins with the older sister Vivian, who's mixed up with Eddie Mars, a local casino owner and gangster. Mars and Marlowe do not get on. "If you want to pick lead out of your belly, get in my way," threatens Mars. And note, his surname is that of the Roman god of war. More great symbolism. "Well, well, a tough guy," says Marlowe, not intimidated. "Only when necessary, soldier," retorts Mars. Eventually, Marlowe solves the case, and there's no one left to blackmail Carmen. But that's not the end of the story. Rusty's disappearance and the effect it's had on Sternwood nags at Marlowe. He could take his money and let it be, but he decides to keep investigating. Welcome to the third act. Again, I'll keep things brief. What Marlowe discovers is a deeper conspiracy, one which has been orchestrated by Eddie Mars. Eddie has one of his goons, Canino, capture Marlowe, a moment of real danger for him, but he's able to escape with the help of Eddie's wife. Marlowe has options now. He could run away, or he could shoot Canino in the back, but he chooses a third option. He once more chooses honor and duty. Instead, he lets Canino know he's there so he can kill him in a fair fight. Marlowe knowingly faces death to preserve his honor. At the end of the story, the bigger conspiracy is solved. Marlowe knows exactly what happened, but Mars is never brought to justice. The world remains dark and corrupt. Now let's head back to Westeros, the second and third acts of Ned's story. The second act begins in earnest when Ned has to put down Sansa's direwolf. Just as with the execution at the start of the book, he does the deed himself, even though that risks insulting the Lannisters. This is a direct parallel to Marlowe resisting the flirtatious advances of Carmen at the start of The Big Sleep, then doing the same with Vivian at the transition to Act 2. Once in King's Landing, Ned begins to investigate Jon Arryn's death. This leads him to track down Robert's bastards, and he eventually discovers that Robert's legal heirs, including Joffrey, are bastards too, fathered by Jaime. Ned solves the case, realizing that Jon Arryn was killed to conceal Cersei and Jaime's incestuous affair and maintain the Lannister claim to the throne. And this is the deeper conspiracy, the Lannister plot to eventually seize power. Ned could go straight to Robert, but remembering how the children of Rhaegar Targaryen had been murdered at the end of the rebellion, he decides to offer Cersei a chance to escape first. Just like Marlowe, Ned knowingly puts himself in danger in order to cling to his morality. Cersei takes her chance to speed up her plot and has Robert murdered too. In the fallout, Ned is arrested and executed, which seems like a more bitter ending than The Big Sleep. But after his death, his son Robb declares independence for the North and scores a stunning victory against the Lannisters. This, in essence, is Robb acting as Ned Reborn. Ned, clinging on to his morals, has allowed them to be passed on to his son, and while we know there will be plenty more dark days for the Starks, in this book, Ned ends up morally victorious. In his famous book, The Hero's Journey, Joseph Campbell synthesizes a collection of common plot beats from myths, legends, and other popular tales. He uses these to create a versatile story archetype, which can be deployed in a number of settings. What I believe George R.R. Martin has done is similarly transplant a new archetype, one which grew out of the pessimism of the 1930s, into Westeros. From our analysis of The Big Sleep in A Game of Thrones, we can begin to codify that archetype. I propose we call it the Hardboiled Journey. The world is dark. The protagonist demonstrates their disillusionment, but also their virtue. They refuse to take on a case. They change their mind and accept the case when it becomes a matter of duty. They demonstrate their virtue again. They enter a world of darker morals and are tempted away from their duty, but they continue to investigate, and cling on to the truth. They solve the case only to discover a deeper conspiracy. Despite an opportunity to walk away, they choose to confront the conspirators. As a result of this choice, they face death, either literal or metaphorical. They end up making a positive impact on the world, no matter what the personal consequences. But the world still remains dark overall. The overall character arc for the protagonist is a flat one. They begin the story representing the thematic truth, and they cling onto it until the end. I bet that if you keep the story beats of the Hardboiled Journey in mind, you'll start seeing them in a whole bunch of your favourite modern myths. For example, this might be a good excuse to break out your The Dark Knight DVDs again. You can use these story beats in a variety of settings to create exciting new stories, just like George R.R. Martin did, but it doesn't stop there. At the start of this video, I joked about how much Martin had borrowed from other writers, from his fancy setting to his hard-boiled plot to the second R in his name. But in reality, this ability to synthesize from what's gone before is its own kind of genius. We have almost 3,000 years of literature to draw from, so we all stand on the shoulders of giants. Martin is far from the only writer to use the technique of transplanting story beats associated with one genre into another. In fact, that's how many of the greatest modern masterpieces were created. Star Wars is maybe the most well-known example. I mentioned Joseph Campbell's hero's journey earlier, and it's very well known that George Lucas very deliberately used these plot beats to drive Luke Skywalker's arc in Star Wars. Tolkien similarly modelled Frodo's adventures in The Lord of the Rings on traditional heroic quest stories like the Holy Grail and Treasure Island. But he transplanted them into a fictional setting as opposed to a historical one. I cover this in more detail here. Noir is a genre closely associated with hard-boiled fiction. It shares a similar setting, but with a very different character arc. In noir, the protagonist is a flawed anti-hero who either continues their descent or finds redemption. Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a noir story set in a post-apocalyptic future. And this is the real secret of how you can supercharge your writing with genre bending. By looking for fresh combinations of setting and archetypal plot beats, you can come up with stories which intrinsically work, but they feel fresh and original. That freshness is more than a feeling, because these new combinations will undoubtedly throw up opportunities to put a new spin on established ideas. For example, his futuristic setting allowed PKD to explore themes like the nature of reality, which wouldn't really be possible in a traditional noir. Similarly, Tolkien uses his fantasy universe to explore whether mortality should be feared or embraced by introducing creatures like ringwraiths and elves. And George R.R. Martin leans into the tropes of the fantasy genre to wrap a complex epic filled with intrigue and mysticism around the relatively simple hard-boiled structure. These are the branches emanating from the trunk of the tree. But there is a caveat here. There's a reason why the examples I've mentioned work, which needs to be true for the combinations you come up with. The setting you're transplanting your plot into needs to be similar enough tonally to the one you're borrowing from. While Ned isn't literally wandering around Westeros in a trench coat and chain smoking, Westeros is a great allegory for 1930s America, as we've already covered. Beware of genre bending haphazardly. Amazon's Rings of Power series tried a similar trick with Galadriel, with her carrying out a gritty, noir-style investigation of Sauron, but most fans agree it failed miserably. In my opinion, there were a lot of issues with how that particular choice was implemented. If you'd like to see me analyse them, hit the like button, share this video, and leave a comment. If this video gets to 3,000 views or 100 likes, I'll do the video. For now, thanks for watching this video and helping me crack the case of Hardboiled Ned. It really means a lot to me,